On this episode of Skeptico.
And I think that's the sadness about so much of science, because it's taken us from, where Christianity in our British culture, Christianity was so thick and it laid in the authorities and it told everybody exactly what to think, what to feel, how to behave. And then science has taken over and done exactly the same thing. And that was a problem in Christianity, and it's a problem in science.
Stay with us for Skeptico.
Welcome to Skeptico, where we explore controversial science and spirituality with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and I suppose I reel on and on about the absurdity of mainstream science's position consciousness. That is, this idea that it's basically an illusion, a product of the brain, biological robot, meaningless universe, all that stuff you've heard a million times, is that we still debate it, that it's still respectable for mainstream science, intellectual types, academia types to kick those ideas around and mull them over and really dig into them when it's just ridiculous. So it's quite refreshing when someone who's totally on the outside and has the dubious distinction of being a prominent member of the neo-Druid, neo-pagan community, let alone the fact that she's a woman. It's just fascinating when someone like that can step forward and just kind of kick the shit out of materialism very succinctly, very concisely, and do so in a way that brings us back to that question that I always ask: how can this be? So Emma Restell-Orr is our guest today. She's the author of many very interesting books, extremely articulate, extremely well written. We, of course, do not agree on some things, on many things, but we agree on many more. And it was certainly fun and delightful to have her on Skeptico and to have her join me in this conversation. Here's my interview with Emma Restell-Orr. Today we welcome Emma Restell-Orr to Skeptico. Emma is the author of several books, including The Wakeful World, Animism, Mind, and the Self in Nature, in which she suggests that animism, this idea that everything, even rocks, trees, stars, are alive with consciousness, well, she dares to suggest that this radical, crazy idea is actually a coherent alternative to scientific materialism. So of course, anyone who's listening to this show knows that I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek, because we all know that scientific materialism has been shown over and over again to be many things, but at its core, just bad science. So I don't think that's going to be surprising to you. But I think Emma's approach might be a little bit different and interesting to Skeptico listeners, because Emma has a long-time background as a Druid and a neo-pagan. So we're going to have some fun times talking about a whole bunch of different stuff. Let me start by saying, Emma, welcome to Skeptico. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope after your introduction there, I can actually make some sense of my thoughts instead of just open my arms and say, listen, this is how I experience life.
No, I think you'll do quite fine. One of the things that, first of all, I have to give a compliment and a praise to my friend Mike Patterson, who kind of nudged me into doing this interview. And Mike has helped me with some other shows. And he said, wow, this is really a cool book. I think it's right up your alley. And I looked at it and I go, wow, this is really interesting. And at the same time, I was intrigued by the whole Druid thing, as I think a lot of people will be. But you don't have a lot of presentations out there, which is the other thing that is exciting to me, and really gets my juices going from a Skeptico perspective, because you are so brilliant. I mean, you just are, and your book is great. And yet I go and look for interviews for you or see you all over the web, and you're not. I mean, there's a couple of presentations on YouTube, but not a lot of kind of give and take interviews. So I'm like, wow, this is really something that needs to be done. So it really is great to have you on.
Well, in part that is because I'm not out there much, because what I found was for decades, perhaps 25 years, I was out there. But almost 10 years ago, it started to feel as if being out in the public eye and everything, all the compromises that meant, being traveling a lot and being in environments where I didn't feel comfortable seemed to me to dilute my experience of, and I'll have to say God, my experience of God. And I know that in saying that word, I'm provoking more queries and eyebrows raised as well. But my experience of, I was perhaps talking more than I was walking my experience of spirituality, of God, of presence in peace, of my understanding of the world. And I wanted to stop talking and do more walking in that respect. So I haven't been out there pushing myself. Also, pushing yourself requires a measure of ego. It requires a coherence of self, a sanity within a world that works on a materialistic basis. And I don't feel sane within that perspective. I am sane within an animistic, selfless coherence, but myself is a little shaky in the modern world, which is why I'm not out there so much. I can be out there, but a little bit insane. You might find me a bit insane.
You know, you just said about 10 things that we could pull apart and have a whole conversation about each one, because it's awesome. Let me just frame this up for people a little bit to give a little context to what you're saying. You are perhaps, and at least according to my friends at Wikipedia, and I'm really saying that tongue-in-cheek when I say that, but you know, you're one of the most famous druids in the world. I mean, you just have to live it. That's the truth, you know, and you
I think I'm going to jump right in there and say perhaps 10 years ago I was.
Well, that's going to stay there for a while. So, okay, you're going to be humble and say other people have passed you by because you've made this very sane decision to, you know, walk the walk, and you can't be talking about the evils of materialism and then trying to pile on the end justifies the means materialism to get ahead, which is stuff we're going to talk about. But still, I just want people to know, I mean, you are or were a major figure in this thing that kind of reached critical mass in terms of consciousness of a lot of people. And then you go to your website and it says, while my time within Druidry was enormously valuable, I will no longer term myself a Druid. So very cool. And I think you just handled that in a beautiful way, but maybe fill people in a little bit on that backstory and what you went through and how you became and why you felt it was necessary to be so prominent in this Druid community.
I think I studied philosophies, spiritualities. I was the kind of kid in my teens who read Wittgenstein, who read the Quran, who read the Bible, who read, you know, the Vedas. I just voraciously explored everything. My husband went to Oxford University to read philosophy, and I read his philosophy books, which he didn't bother to read. That was, you know, I was like 17, 18 years old, and just exploring everything and asking all the key questions. But I was also brought up, my parents they're coming towards, you know, they're in their retirement now and meandering in different worlds. But my mother's a botanist, my father is an ornithologist. And so I was brought up in the wild. I was brought up with an understanding, with a teaching that nature is the most important thing. It's what you focus on. It's what life is about. So my exploration, my search for God went hand in hand with my immersion in the non-human world, the natural world, and the study of it. My father is very much a scientific ornithologist. He's not sentimental in any way. So when I lived in Japan for a while and found that the spirituality, the deep experience of life, the understanding of the sacred, the aesthetic, really touched my heart. I started to understand it, but I started thinking, well, these aren't my ancestors. Shinto is very close to Druidry in that respect. It's very much about ancestors, but within the context of the natural world. So I came back to England to seek out my own ancestors, my ancestry, and to find a religion, a spirituality, a philosophy of being that was from this land. I had a friend in Maine, a Druid, a student of mine who's now in Maine in the States. And he said to me once, when he came over to England, he said, I understand now what you mean. Druidry is this landscape in England. It's the English land or the British landscape. It's the mud, the trees, the wind. It's the religion of these islands.
Yeah, okay, but that's also kind of tricky. I mean, it's kind of like Christianity, you know, it sounds good. And then when you start really pulling apart that history and the Celtic past, and it gets really kind of blurry about who those people really were. So I totally get what you're saying on one level, but on another level.
But you've come at it from the wrong perspective, if I might say. You've come at it from the perspective of an accepted narrative instead of the perspective of experience, and then used the word to describe the experience. So Druidry is the earliest word we have for the religion of these lands. Mm-hmm. We understand one of the earliest texts describes Druidry, for Caesar describes Druidry as coming from these islands. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter, but we can't talk about Druidry as the religion of the Celts when we don't really understand the Celts aren't really a part of these islands at all. That's just a political, after description. It's not about what was happening here 2,500 years ago.
Point well taken. But just let me interject, because this is kind of an interesting dialogue, and I've never really had this with anyone in the past, but you're hitting on something I think is kind of interesting. See, like, for example, I do not have that strong sense of connection to place that a lot of people do. And I totally respect that. I totally respect where you're coming from, and respect in the sense that I think it's completely genuine. And I think some people experience that at a very deep level. And I think other people don't, So do you know where I'm coming from? I mean, like, one thing I always get is people go, because I have a Greek name, and I was raised in a very Greek community in Chicago, Illinois, here in the United States, but there was this strong connection, and everyone spoke Greek and went back to Greece. I've never felt any connection. I've never been to Greece. I've never had any interest in going to Greece. So I don't feel like that holds me back spiritually. It's just kind of my nature. So the Druid thing always seems like exactly what you're saying, kind of connected to place, which is cool, but how do you make that? How do you pull that apart?
That's interesting, because when I used to teach Druidry around the world, in the States, in South America, and in Australia, all around, the sort of the Celtic or the British diaspora, the Druidic diaspora. And I would be teaching people to explore the context, their ecology, the land that they're living in, while at the same time understanding that the only way they can reach Druidry is through their ancestors. Because Druidry is not the religion of that landscape, it's the religion of perhaps their ancestors. For me in Britain, I get to Druidry through the landscape and to some extent through my ancestors. I say to some extent because I can't weave a line that is clear in my head that goes back name by name by name by name, thousands and thousands of years. I understand, I honor my ancestors and the names of my ancestors and where they come from, but I only know that two and a half centuries back to the beginning of the 19th century. So from there, it becomes abstract. It becomes a merge of blood, of culture, of heritage, of value, of land, of the smell of the rain, of the taste of the mud. All of these things kind of meld into an understanding, which for me is spirituality, is my religion. But thinking about Christianity makes no sense to me from that same, that makes no sense to me because it's not of this landscape. But then if I go into a local Church of England church that's maybe almost 1,000 years old, built in sort of Norman stone, in a rural environment in the middle of England, I can look around and that feels like my heritage, because there's very little Middle Eastern culture, there's very little Middle Eastern tradition or story there. It's all entirely diluted into Englishness. And most of the festivals the Harvest Festival, even Easter, all of these festivals are saturated with English culture, with English heritage. And that I can understand. It's when we get into the mythic, determined to be real characters of the stories that I get into trouble. But then I get into trouble when we talk about Welsh mythology, because I don't understand that. It's not of the landscape of my blood, which is very much English. It's here. It's in, London, that the counties around London and where I'm living here. It doesn't go up into Wales or Scotland. So it's very local, very, very local indeed. In terms of culture, language, and the way the people are. In England, I always think that a quality of the English nature, the nature of the English is about whatever works. We do what works. Whatever works is fine. And some people deride paganism for being a kind of a pick and mix religion. You take a bit from here, you take a bit from there, but fine. I don't see what's wrong with that, although in practice I don't grok it, I don't understand it much. But in theory I understand it because it's about whatever works.
Let me push it a little bit further because I think this is just such a fascinating point. To me, it seems like the lines get really blurry as soon as we go back a little bit. Like, let's take ancestor worship. I am totally in connection with my ancestors. I feel their presence. I ask for their help and guidance. I've never said this on the show before, but that's okay. But I also feel drawn to Neem Karoli Baba from India, right? And I have this strange connection with yoga that's just popped up in my life and Hindu practice. I don't know where that's coming from, and I haven't explored that fully, but that is there in an undeniable way. So I'm not, resistant to anything you're saying. I'm just saying for me and for a lot of people I know, it just isn't that clean cut where I can say, gee, I feel this connection. And man, my connections seem to be very, very blurred and in a lot of other ways that feel totally good as I connect to them. They don't feel out of place or anything, but I live in Southern California in San Diego. Man, I remember when I first came here, I felt a connection to this place. I felt like this is more where I'm supposed to be. I don't know if this is the ultimate place where I'm supposed to be, but this is more where I'm supposed to be than Chicago, where I grew up.
Yeah, and I grew up in Denmark, in Spain, in South America, and the Far East. I was in Chicago for a few years as a child, so all over the place. And actually, it was my desire to connect with my ancestors that brought me to England and to commit to living in England. My brother is in the States. He's a professor at State College in Pennsylvania. And my son is in the States. And so I have a sense of that global identity, but for myself, for my own need, and I think this is specific, I think there are people that strive for a connection with God, godness, deity, whatever that means, whatever that we understand that to be. And there are some that don't. There are some who strive to connect through their ancestors, through the land, and some who strive through their reason, through community, through archetypes or other kinds of culture, mythology. For me, ancestry was very important. And I would rationally, looking at it in a psychological perspective, that must be, I would imagine, connected to the fact that I have a genetic weakness in my nervous system, which my grandmother has, my aunt has, and it goes back through my grandmothers. So that has inspired me to understand my ancestry perhaps better than if I were fighting fit and had no need to see where these things came from. But I think it's like anything. Once you start to explore it, you either grok it, it either feeds you or it doesn't. And I find that a lot of people, once they start to know the names of their ancestors, start to know where they come from, start to breathe in and eat the food of that place, they start to find a deeper connection. Without that, they don't know that there's a superficiality and unrootedness about their being. But once they start to find those roots, they can find a deep nourishment. Not everybody does, but sometimes that can be an enormous source of nourishment and learning. And I would recommend it to anybody.
Okay, so I'm stuck on this now and I can't let it go. What about reincarnation? I mean, a lot of people have direct experience with memories of their past life. And I don't want to judge that one way or another, other than to say the best science that we have in terms of looking at that, like the folks at University of Virginia, Jim Tucker, and before that, Dr. Ian Stevenson, undeniable. I mean, just seems to be a reality, and it's been passed down in just about virtually every wisdom tradition, including Druidry, right? So reincarnation takes that in a whole different direction. I mean, forget about, connection to the land, the soil. You're all over the globe. Some people would say even outside of this earth thing, in terms of these lives. So isn't it, again, kind of a fuzzy line where we draw and say, and it just sounds a little off. Whenever I hear someone say blood, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Isn't it kind of bigger than that?
It is very much bigger than that. And I think, when you talk about blood, you're talking about things which are immediate sensory connection. So I love the desert. I love the Mediterranean coast. I love the forest down, 300 miles away. All of that, I love it. But what's right here at the moment is the wood of the table that I'm sitting at. That's a deep, immediate sensory experience. It doesn't mean that other things aren't important. I'm not connected to other things. But also, I have had what I believed were clear experiences within myself and within other people of reincarnation, of stories that made sense, that connected in ways that we couldn't have understood. And yet now I don't believe in reincarnation. I have a sense of the mindedness of nature, of the universe, the minded coherence, or the minded coherence of the wholeness of nature, of all of the universe. And within that, we have coherences of mind that are in 1,000 different ways, including the mind of humanity, the mindedness of humanity. And then, so to have human beings, human personalities, entities, all stuck in their own sticky individual beings, and then we have those edges that spill out from those individual beings into the wholeness of families, the wholeness of blood, the wholeness of communities, the wholeness that happens when you love and merge with someone in that melting way of connection. And then you have, the broader race, tribe, nation, whatever it may be. Some of those words work, some of them don't. But I think we can connect into that mindedness and pick up on coherences, pick up on patterns, pick up on stories, and we hear the ones that make sense to us. We hear the ones which in some ways mirror repeating patterns or ways that we are perceiving the world in patterns. And that's what I think we translate, we interpret to be reincarnation. I don't think reincarnation works because I think nature in itself doesn't have a chronological process of time that would really make that work.
You kind of have a point there in terms of our understanding of time and this linear notion we know is probably not accurate in some ways that we don't totally understand. But I have to kind of push on that a little bit because, this path on this show has been kind of one foot in two worlds, one foot in the science world and the best science we can understand, and at the same time discarding the science that is just ridiculous and is pulling us in the wrong direction, which is something you do quite wonderfully. I don't want to get too far away from the book, folks, because I want you to go out and buy the book and our other books because they're wonderful. But what I really want to do is introduce you to Emma and her broader ideas. But I just want folks to know the book is very, very well-structured, coherent, as strong as cases you'll find for kind of dismantling this silly materialism and replacing it with a very viable and philosophically strong argument for animism. But I digress because I can't help but talking about reincarnation, because I get this a lot from folks. And, in the real intellectualizing of it within like the parapsychology community, they call into play super psi. Have you ever heard of super psi?
No, I haven't.
Well, it's basically the same idea that you just said, kind of Akashic records. Hey, we're all plugged into the consciousness field everywhere, and we can draw, this and that. And that's how these stories of reincarnation happen. I just have to point out to you that the scant bit of scientific evidence we have, the best we've tried to collect it, and science now here in this sense being a method of collecting data, not a position statement, not saying this is how things are, but just, hey, these are some tools we can use to strip away our biases. In that method, what these guys at University of Virginia did, one of the things they did that's just really kind of stunning is they not only get people that have these detailed memories like you're talking about. So they'll find a child 4 or 5 years old, and the child reports, hey, I remember being in this town, in this village that I've never visited 100 miles away, and they go there and all the things line up. But what they did on the physical level that's really hard to get around with the super psi idea is in a significant number of these people, they found birthmarks that correspond to traumatic experiences like getting shot or being stabbed as being the incident that caused their death. And there's just pretty overwhelming evidence that stuff lines up. Again, these guys have looked at it scientifically. So I don't know if the science really points in the direction you're saying.
But that's exactly where my problem is with the scientific method, or not the scientific method, the scientific perspective, is that it is so comprehensively limited by human perception. So what we're saying is that this is what we as human beings see, but that's not what nature is in itself. And
of course,
this is why the journey, what I would call God, the wholeness of the universe, the everything, the journey to God is about finding a way of an almost impossible, an ecstatically brilliant, glorious, hopeless, wonderful, obsessive way of getting through the limitation.
Let me interject something. Let me tell you, because we'll get right to the point here. I have an interview coming up, and I just booked it, and I was really resistant to booking it with this woman because some of her ideas sound way out there, but it's cool, and I respect where she's coming from. But she's had hundreds of near-death experiences. And in those near-death experiences, she claims that she's connected with Jesus. Jesus, not Christ consciousness, some kind of Jesus. And Walt Disney as well, which really then throws you for a loop. And I've spoken with a lot of folks, and I don't consider them, crazy or weird or any of that stuff, but have different interpretations of their spiritually transformative experiences, their relationship with God, all the stuff you're saying. So obviously, science is limited, but what the fuck are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to sort this thing out? Is everyone just supposed to say, well, whatever my personal experience is? I tell you, that is wrought with problems too. I've interviewed a lot of people who take their spiritual experiences and turn it into some kind of cultish, crazy kind of thing. So I don't know what we're supposed to do.
I think that's absolutely the key. What we are supposed to do, perhaps. What am I to say? Who am I to say? But what we're supposed to do maybe is not to take our personal experience and lay it down as some truth. It's not. It's our experience from our individual perspective, from our point of perception. And if we could understand the mindedness of the universe as being patterns beyond limit, but so many patterns as we come, I mean, vast patterns from the, outside of our ability to imagine through to patterns within the human mind. You hear that people say time and again, it's a small world. And we find doppelgangers. We see, I found someone, I knew someone who looked just like you. And you think, no, everyone's unique. Well, we're not. There aren't that many kinds of people. There aren't that many kinds of experience. There aren't that many kinds of perception or idea. Actually, the human-mindedness, the wholeness of humanity is not that diverse. We think it's extraordinary because we're sitting in the middle of it and we're too small to see how small it is. We think it's extraordinary and vast and enormous and glorious, but actually it's not that diverse. So when, as human beings, we are able to just slip out of our individual perception, our individual separated self, and touch into the wholeness of something beyond, touch into the wholeness of a part of the mindedness of humanity, then what are we going to see? We're going to see a mess of chaos. But if you look at the meadow, stand in the meadow and look down, what are you going to see? You're going to see, first of all, the things that you recognize. You're not going to see the chaos and the patterns that you've never seen before. You're going to see the greens, you're going to see the beetles, you're going to see the spider's webs, because those are things that you understand that you've seen before. So when we look out at the wholeness, into the wildness of the mindedness of humanity, we will see the things that make sense to us, consciously or subconsciously, through our conscious awareness or down through the shadows on the edges of our awareness, of our understanding. And that's what we'll pick up on. And then as we bring it into our individuated self, our own little coherence of mind as a human being, we'll interpret that into the stories, the patterns, the language that makes sense to us, that we use to make sense of the world. We'll say, oh, that's a beetle, or, oh, that is a cowboy, or that's Napoleon, or this is Jesus, or whatever it may be. So we're finding patterns and we're interpreting them for ourselves in ways that make sense. Because if we can't make sense, then we're crazy.
Well, I'm right there with you. But to me, that is the starting point. That is the jumping off point, for me with science, with trying to understand things. And here I am defending science. I'm always knocking down science on the show, but I have to defend science here for a minute. What the promise of science is take everything you said, and I agree with it completely, right? But now what I want to know you. I want to know Emma's experience, and I want to know, Mike's experience. And I want to grow and enrich my experience from their experience. And I want to find out how this consensus reality, because I know your experience is different than my experience, but I know it also overlaps in some interesting ways that might inform my decisions about answering those big picture questions of who am I and why am I here. So I can only answer those questions to myself, but your experience could help me. So when I'm trying to filter all these different experiences and try and understand them and systematically use those, I need some tools. And here are some tools that kind of help. I mean, again, we were talking about reincarnation. If you ever read Ian Stevenson's work, if you ever read Jim Tucker's work, there's a deep, deep spirituality in what they're saying, but they're handling it just purely from an objective, how do these different experiences, how are they similar? How are they different? Without a lot of, then we can figure out what that means to us. So do you get where I'm coming from there or no?
Yes, I do, in that science is a tool. And I would agree with that completely. And I think when we use science as a tool, it is useful. When we use science as a way of determining truth, then we've meandered into some kind of arrogance. Doesn't make sense. And the same is true of, well, pretty much everything. It's all about tools. Even time, we could say, is a tool. Even our understanding of space is a tool. And while that's the problem with our materialistic assumptions, with the assumption in our culture and the assumptions which have been laid down by monotheisms as well, in our Western culture. So the monotheisms and the science which has overlaid it, and then the monotheisms on top of that science, and again, we come to this compacted assumption that stops us from understanding the universe without the need for truth, without the need for a universal truth, without the need to assert and determine that our understanding is a universal truth. It's all about relationships and tools to make those relationships healthy, harmonious, and productive, creative, sharing the creativity, so that our being, our relationships help instead of hinder.
Without getting too abstract, I think what it also does is it taps into this very basic fundamental need we have for being in control, or at least maintaining the illusion of being in control. I mean, really, when you break it down, that's what materialism is all about. It's saying, hey, there's all these rules, and these rules work perfectly, and we can measure everything, and everything's going to come out okay. And I think everything beyond that only happens when we give up this sense of, we're really not in control.
Yes, and I think that's the sadness about so much of science, because it's taken us from, where Christianity in our British culture, Christianity was so thick, and it laid in the authorities, and it told everybody exactly what to think, what to feel, how to behave. And then science has taken over and done exactly the same thing.
Right.
And that was a problem in Christianity, and it's a problem in science. And it's only when we break apart both of those that we can find the value in both of them. And I would take that back to Druidry, and to Hinduism, and to Islam, and to everything. I mean, there are folk in paganism who are doing just the same thing.
Right. I want to talk about that. We all have this need or this ability or this blind spot to spin into orthodoxy, right? And to be rule following, I just tell me the answer so I don't have to think too much.
Yes. And that's like saying, well, there's life and there's death, and you're alive or you're dead, and that's it. And there's black and there's white, and there's none of that. There is just the being, the experience of being in the mindedness, in a profusion of patterns that we perceive in various different ways. That's what it's about. But that's for most people, that's the way of madness, because we use all these tools in order to tap down or smash down, hammer down a reality. And a reality, I would define reality as that which we need to believe in order to stay sane. So it's got nothing to do with the actuality of the universe. It's about what we need to believe is true in order to stay sane.
Yeah, it's what helps us sleep at 2:00 in the morning when you wake up and you're like, oh, okay, what can I think about to just help me go back to sleep, right?
Well, even that, even it just helps us to walk through doorways. It helps us to stand upright.
Right.
To commit into relationships or have children or, make decisions. And all of these things are what we hammer down into a reality which is too structured. And then we pass off this reality as truth, as universal truth.
I don't know if we need that reality, but we do need that reality to function in some ways that we choose to function. Family is a great one. If you want to I have 4 kids. I love my kids. I love my wife. We've been together for a long time. My wife has never listened to one Skeptico. She's never listened to one episode. She used to help me with the recording on the beginning, but not her thing, So we have to function in a lot of different worlds that sometimes overlap, sometimes don't, and we're making those trade-offs, right?
We are, but I think this is the issue with animism. When I talk to people about animism, they immediately have an idea of animism which is languaged, which is imagined, which is perceived through that materialistic or monotheistic framework of reality that's honed, that's hammered into something that's solid. And animism isn't like that. So from that perspective, you look at animism, and animism is very childish. It's about believing there's this little spirit in a tree that you can talk to. It's about, believing the rocks. If you sit and listen quietly enough, they'll speak English to you as well. And
that's the fairy tale definition, that the cartoonish definition of what people have about animism, right?
That's right. It's the same in Christianity. Like there's Jesus sitting on a cloud with a big beard. It's exactly the same. And when people realize that that's not what animism is, that's like you can't say Christianity is about looking up to a cloud, and there's a guy out there with a beard. Well, animism is not about looking at a stone or a river and thinking there's a spirit that, if you squeeze your eyes closed a little bit, you'll see a sort of a mist that's the spirit, and then it's just ludicrous. It's so childish. That's not what it's about. It's about the essence of what nature is made of. Is it made of that dualist perspective? Is it made of the ghost, the consciousness, the thinking, and then there's the inert molecules, the subatomic particles, and that's it. So those ghosts, those consciousnesses are only in special parts of nature, and the rest is just thoughtless, mindless, dead. Or is, from an animistic perspective, it's the other extreme. It's take those two duality, those two ideas, and smash them apart. Don't discard them, but smash them to pieces. Because only in totally smashing them to pieces do you get that glorious diffusion of everything.
And I'd actually say it slightly, I get where you're coming from, but I'd say it in a slightly different way, because in your book, The Wakeful World, what you do is draw the contrast, the relief, if you will, and say, okay, let's look at materialism. Does that really hold together? And when you start picking it apart, then for the average person who's coming at this, by comparison, you're already drawn to animism, because you're like, wow, that really is so ridiculous. You mean I'm just this biological robot in a meaningless world? Nothing is real. My experience isn't real. Nothing else matters, or I'm not interacting. It sounds at that point so absurd and so crazy that I think anyone is open to, well, what's the alternative?
It's not even that it's meaningless. Because the meaninglessness to me is somehow it's a human emotional response to the reality. Use that word. If you look at it rationally, scientifically, if you like, use the tools of science, there is no understanding in science of what consciousness is. There are people like your friend going through stories, they're anecdotal stories, and they're looking at research, but it's through narratives, through stories, through experience. But what is consciousness? Nobody knows. And the fact that nobody knows what consciousness is really hidden in our world. People don't talk about it. There's an assumption that someone knows that, because if you don't know what consciousness is, then why are you giving antipsychotic drugs? What are these antidepressant drugs? What are these drugs that shift consciousness? I'm not talking about plants and drugs that come out of nature.
But they don't answer the question either. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's organic. It's still the same question. One of the ways to get there is the Hindu neta, neta, neta. I mean, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. It's also this origin of the skeptico of the Greek philosophers. Keep asking the question. It's not that, it's not that. So we don't know what consciousness is. And as we get closer to it, and as we understand that perhaps consciousness is fundamental, it is the base of everything, then that means it's going to be impossible to ever know what consciousness is. But what we can do, and what is useful, and what you are doing, is saying, you know what? It appears that consciousness is not this. It's not purely an epiphenomenon of the brain. It isn't manufactured the way we manufacture cars. It isn't neurologically based.
It doesn't make any sense to look at where consciousness emerged. When did consciousness suddenly come into, we look at way back to At what point does it? It's a category error. It doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
It emerged out of something else. It can't. It's too different. It's absolutely fundamentally different. And it's disrespectful. Now I'm shifting it from the scientific to the spiritual, and putting in that word. For me, it's disrespectful to imagine that it's not fundamental. And disrespecting anything is a way of making sure that we don't work with it in harmony, that we misuse it, that we don't understand it fundamentally. So if you think you understand it, or you discard the need to understand it, or you assume someone else understands it, it's that wonderful thing that materialists say, well, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain or physicality, the nervous system coming together. But they don't tell us where it emerged in evolution, out of nature itself. So there's a massive gap. It just stands on nothing. The idea that it is completely foundless. And that's, again, it's hidden. It's an incredibly disingenuous perspective, yet it is so fundamental to modern Western culture and modern Western capitalism as well.
Yeah, that takes us in a whole different direction, which is fundamental to really trying to pull this apart, which is, what is the relationship between these scientific paradigms, this dogma, and the agenda over here in terms of controlling people and control systems and all the rest of that.
Yes.
Maybe we want to talk about that. I certainly think it's inescapable to see. I look at it this way. I said, if you want to run the world, if you want to be Julius Caesar and go kill all the Druids, or I think it was, who was it, went and just wiped them off the face of the earth. But if you want to run the world in the modern world, how would you want people to act? And I think the way you'd want them to act is the way George Bush wanted him to act when he invaded Iraq after 9/11 and said, just go shopping, just go down to your mall and continue your shopping, people, continue doing the mindless stuff that you do. That is the quintessential experience of how scientific materialism infiltrates into, the collective consciousness in terms of what we do.
And in fact, you can go back to Julius Caesar. His aim wasn't to wipe out the Druids. His aim was to take over areas where there were great trade resources.
To control the people, to control thought, yes. Right?
Exactly, yeah. So, yes, it's controlling consciousness by giving that opium of trade, of consumerism. And it's impossible to consume in a way that is good for capitalism if everything around you is minded, if you understand that everything has its own right to thrive, to live, to be itself. You can't just go wiping out environments. You can't breed and abuse animals. You can't do any of this. Animism in itself has to, as a philosophy, it brings us to a point of minimal consumerism, which is not good for capitalism.
But the flip side of that, and anyone will bring this up, and it's rightful to do so, is that if we look at our history over the last 100 years, it's been a battle of two ideological systems, capitalism and communism, if you will. And certainly any thinking person is going to choose capitalism over communism. Communism has been a complete failure. Talking about, completely, one, because it's atheistic, it completely denies, as wrong as Christians might be or extreme fundamentalist Islamists might be, they're at least in the ballgame of saying there's more. The atheistic, there is nothing, we are biological robots, life is meaningless thing, and the implementation of that by Mao or Stalin or all the communists we've seen come along in the last 100 years is just disastrous to the soul of people. So, it's two really bad choices, but I don't know. You just got to be fair in that sense.
But fundamentally, both capitalism and communism are about the control of capital and how you lay down an authority over the people as to how you distribute that capital, and what kind of power the people have about what their input is in terms of that distribution of capital. So in that respect, they're both about consumerism.
Yeah, but the only time I ever hear people talking about an alternative and, springing towards some anarcho-cap or whatever system we're going to have, it always seems to me to be built on this infrastructure that was created by capitalism. They always say, well, now we have the internet, so we can do this. And that's like, well, wait a minute. You're kind of assuming, it's like, give me one miracle and I can explain the rest. Well, give me, a world wide web with total information flow and all the rest of that. And then we can build a fair and just and equitable system. I don't know. You can't really go there.
No, I think it comes down to each individual person. I think it has to, because even from an anarchic perspective, my perspective as an anarchist, I would say that as an individual, you have to be responsible for yourself, and you have to be responsible for how much you interact, you engage, and take from the world, take from your ecosystem, your environment, your community, in terms of consumption, how much you consume, and how that level of consumption affects the wider world. So you must be responsible for yourself and responsible for your interaction, how much you consume. So it doesn't matter if it's on the internet or just in your local village or town. It's all about consumption. You reduce your consumption and then you're starting to get somewhere. Just reduce until you're at a point where you are surviving and joyful. You don't just be clear what you need and what you want.
The only problem I always have with that when I talk to anarchists, because philosophically I'm right there, where it always seems to break down is that we are going to need some kind of collective decision making. And are you willing to submit to majority rule, I guess, is what it comes down to. Because I'm not. I mean, I am iconoclastic, way over the top, but I also have an opportunity with my life and my situation where I have a lot of freedom and a lot of choices. So I can kind of rock either way in terms of going along. It doesn't affect me too much. But are the anarchists really willing to say, well, if somebody doesn't want to do it your way and somebody wants to raise a bunch of industrial cattle and everyone goes, and 70% of people go along with that, then do you go along with that, or do you go start,
well, that's
bombing the place and, doing all this crazy, like you said, kind of doing all the crazy stuff that goes against the fundamental idea of the spiritual truth, which is to be in yourself and to realize that we just have to kind of be okay with whatever happens. Ultimately, while we're trying to affect change, fundamentally, everything's going to be okay.
I don't know if everything's going to be okay.
Okay.
I'm not sure that that's the point. I think that holding on to that fine thread that says everything's going to be okay is sometimes a way of not taking immediate action, immediate responsibility now. But I still think it's about oneself. I think in terms of are we going to be okay with what other people want? Well, that's about education. And that's why, for me, animism and anarchy go together. We don't live in a world which perceives animistically. Therefore, it wouldn't work, in my perspective, it wouldn't work to be in a world which functioned anarchically. Because anarchy it comes from that same perspective. Where you understand that everything has a right to be, everything has a right to thrive, and you don't abuse or intervene in the world beyond what you need to. So you can't say, yes, if everyone is working in an animistic way, then the anarchy would work. If everyone is still thriving, striving, grasping for their own little bit of capital, for their own little bit of survival in a capitalist world, then anarchy doesn't work. Just like communism doesn't work when it's still based on consumerism in that way. It's still based on capital. We have to get rid of this notion of capital and start to understand the notion of relationship and the ecosystem of our world. When we're working purely on relationship, one-to-one, me with the ground, me with the rain, me with the river, me with the neighbors, me with the birds, me with the source of water, the source of food, and everything in that web of understanding everything is minded, and our level of respect changes, then anarchy has a possible future. But without that, I think anarchy within a capitalist system or a consumerist system cannot work.
As I was mentioning a minute ago, this hasn't gone exactly the way that I planned, but I think it's great. I love that. I hope people are getting a sense for who you are, and who you are right now, because then they can go check you out and check out the work that you're doing and follow you if you want to be followed. Maybe you don't want to be followed.
No, read the books, but don't follow me. I'm like a cat, I don't like to be followed. I'll turn around and snarl.
Cool. So in the physical sense or in the kind of social media sense, you're not kind of out there all the time, but you want these ideas to get out there, which is totally cool. I get that. That's totally fair. And actually, that's it's the paradox again, which I think has been a reoccurring theme in this conversation, which is important to me. The only things that are true are paradoxical. I mean, it's always, and here's a paradox that I wanted to pick up on, because a minute ago I said, it's all going to be okay is kind of, and really I say that, and then immediately what goes off in my head is my mantra is really the opposite of that. It's not going to be okay. Nothing is going to be okay, because my little scheming mind that says, I want this, or I want this for my kids, or I want this for myself, or I want to be healthy, all that stuff is going to go away. None of it is going to work out exactly the way that I want. And am I okay with the fact that it's not going to be perfect? It's not going to be okay. So,
yes. And also when we think about something being okay, we have an idea, as you said, we have an image, an expectation of what that means. And it's not even about letting go of that and allowing something else to be. It's about letting go of the expectation itself, because expectation
completely right.
It's part of what makes us inflexible. It makes us defensive. It makes us protective of what we have, and all kinds of bad human behaviors. It's much easier to have nothing and have nothing to lose and not expect stuff. Everything is a bonus. Everything is wonderful when it comes.
Well, this is deep spirituality. I mean, virtually every wisdom tradition has that at some core. But as we said before, it sometimes gets obscured or it manifests in a different way. So now you have ascetic monks who don't know why they're kneeling on wood and don't have any possessions. They've just, hey, that's how we've always done it at this monastery. But they're not really aware of why they're doing what they're doing.
Yes, which is a shame. I think there are a lot of spiritual traditions, including old pagan traditions, and that are doing things because that's the way it's done. One of the good things about modern Druidry is that it was shattered. It's not an ancient tradition. It existed a long time ago, but it's not, only in some very skinny ways has it passed all the way down into the 20th, 19th, 20th, 21st centuries. And that's the fact that it's been broken is quite valuable. I remember having long talks with First Nation Canadians, Native Americans, Maoris, people who have a tradition which is unbroken, and talking about how they struggle with the rigidity of tradition. They struggle with the superstitions that have been in there for so many hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, and a neo-paganism. Shouldn't, some do, but it isn't necessary to have those superstitions. It can be bright and awake and a part of a modern mind.
You know, that's a question that I have to ask, because the image that a lot of people are going to have when they think Druid is going to be all the images, you know, the white robes, kind of the earthy stick there, or some kind of, you know the image. And some of that is associated with some people who practice Druidry. You know, let's deconstruct that a little bit. Why the nonconformity? I mean, I get it as kind of a reactionary thing, but also there seems to be a little theater shock factor there that I don't quite get.
Have you seen what bishops wear in the church?
Totally, but I'm not Christian. I think it's totally bizarre. I think it's cultish. I think it's designed to control people. It's a cultish practice. So and in Druidry, I would suggest that the vast majority of people within the modern Druid movement here, in Britain, I'd say probably across Europe, have nothing to do with that kind of theatre. They don't dress up. They wouldn't be, people wouldn't assume or know that they were Druids unless they started talking to them. So it is a small fringe of theatricality, of ostentation, of it's like, the hippies on the edge. And that's really not what Druidry is as a whole. You go to a conference here in England that is Druidry, a Druidic conference, and most people are very mainstream in the way that they look and the work that they do. They tend to work in caring or artistic professions, not in corporate, monsters, but they still are working within the mainstream of society. So it's that theatricality is just on the edge. And I played out there in the wild, because I've never been very good in the mainstream. I was out there, but that was partly because when I first came to Druidry in the mid to late 1980s, it was very patriarchal, very soft, abstract. There were men leading the groups. There was a lot of intellectualization. It had no soul, I didn't think. I couldn't find it. I had no woman's soul. And so I went in there in my late 20s and stomped and yelled and brought in some rich, wild, shamanic energy and shook it up. And I did. I made a difference. Although I say it myself, I did. I made a difference in there. And then I got together with a fellow called Philip Shallcross, who was working in a very shamanic way, and I use that word with slight wince. It's a word that people understand. Right.
The wildness, the understanding that Druidry is a tradition of learning. It's a tradition of study. One thing we know about the Druids of 2,000 years ago and more is that they were an intellectual elite, or they were the educated, and they had authority because they were educated. And I think that's why it was easy for Caesar and others to wipe them out, because they stood on their authority. And I don't like that. I'm glad that was wiped out, because that's what I don't like. I mean, I wouldn't go for Caesar instead of the Druids, but, the standing on your authority and taking power is not a part of the spiritual path that I understand. But that doesn't take away from Druidry as a learning tradition. If you come across Druids who know nothing, they're not doing Druidry. It's about studying nature. It's not about studying Druidry. It's about studying nature.
Okay. I got that. So what are you bringing to the table? What is Druidry telling me about the big picture questions I want to know? Who am I? Why am I here? I mean, that's why I've done 100 shows on near-death experience. That's why I'm interested in mediumship from a scientific standpoint, or reincarnation. I want to answer the big questions. What does Druidry tell me about this extended consciousness realm, which seems to be at the center of everything?
Dick, I'm going to go back and before you interrupted me so beautifully, which is study nature. And that includes study human nature. Study it as deeply and fully as you can. So for me, as you'll see in my books, that includes for me studying the heritage of my philosophy. So the heritage of Western philosophy. Going outside of that where it can help me, studying Hinduism and Buddhism, Shintoism, whatever it may be. Studying until I understand more what works in terms of my perspective, my perception. And that includes, or that brings us, when your focus is on nature, that brings you to a respect and a wakefulness and a willingness to open your mind to what nature truly is.
But Emma, you have to realize anyone could say that. Anyone can and does say that. There's a bunch of New Agers who, at the end of the day, seem to have very nasty ulterior motives, who say exactly the same thing. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but I'm saying we got to be a little bit more specific.
How? What do you want?
Like I've just told you, I feel that I'm nudging closer to this truth when I study a compilation of 2,000 near-death experience studies that happened after someone died. And I say, well, now clearly I know that consciousness survives death. Whatever phony baloney timeline I'm going to put on that, I realize I accept what you're saying, that timelines are problematic, but I know that my consciousness isn't limited to when this body stops breathing. That nudges me a step closer. When I realize that the consistent evidence from that knowledge is that there is a moral imperative. There is such a thing as right and wrong. It isn't just all whatever we make up. That nudges me a little bit closer. That's an idea I hold on to. What have you learned from nature that you can offer us?
What you're saying is that you're studying stories and patterns. So you're just reading other people's stories.
Well, no, everybody says that. I mean, I'm experiencing. I'm reading and experiencing. I'm meditating every day. I'm walking out on the beach, many times. I'm experiencing. So that always seems kind of trite when people say you're reading other people's experience. I mean, we're all interacting with the extended consciousness all the time, whether we want to or not.
That's not what I'm saying. If you're asking me, so what is it specifically that Druidry can offer or I can offer? What I'm saying is that what we're all doing is we're studying stories and experience, other people's experience and our own experience, and we're studying stories and we're narrating our own experience. We're doing the same thing. You're saying, well, everyone can say that, and I'm saying, yes, that's human nature. That's what we're doing. It is absolutely simple. It's all the same stuff. What you're saying is, hang on a minute, but where are we finding some truth? I'm not saying there isn't any truth. All it is about doing the simple stuff. That's it. Just absolutely simple and getting it right. And we know we're getting it right when we're living in a sustainable harmony. And that sounds trite as well, because it's simple, because that's all there is.
Let me throw out one of my ways of measuring truth that I'm kind of going towards. So one of the things I have is, and it's out of the Bible, I'm not a big Bible person at all, but you'll know them by their fruits, right? So I love people in the alternative spiritual community, and I consider myself in the alternative spiritual community, even though I don't know what the heck that means. But I run across people in the occult or esoteric or Wicca or all this, and they hit with the Aleister Crowley thing, and I just want to say, great, perfect example. Let's know him by his fruits. A despicable human being. We don't need to overthink that. We don't need to hear about how the Beatles loved him or how he changed society. He lived a despicable life from every way we can record it. So I take him as an example of maybe I want to kind of question more what he's doing. Now, I could run across, I always mention my friend Rick Archer, who does this beautiful show called Buddha at the Gas Pump, and the title kind of says all you need to know, which is that there are beautifully spiritually awakening, we can never say awakened, but awakening people who are living very ordinary lives, who aren't out there on the book tour doing this, but have living in harmony, I guess is the way that you'd probably say it, and have found a way to communicate that. And they are, just when you are in their presence, they are delivering the fruit. They are saying, this is what it means to really be alive. So, that's an example to me of how we find truth, is by the fruit of what that person is bringing.
How we find the value, how we find lessons that are worth absorbing, lessons that are worth learning. Yes, absolutely. Because again, it's about relationship. You can find sound, nourishing, innovating relationships with people who are peaceful, joyful, who are living well. And that's exactly what you're saying. I would agree entirely. You find someone who lifts your heart, and you allow that to lift your heart to make a relationship, and that changes our perspective. I mean, Crowley's perspective was about power, as so many people is. If you're looking for power, then you're into that authority, capital, truth, universal truth, declarations of this and that, ego. It's about declaring oneself to know more than others. It's not about that. It's about listening and being a part of it, merging, melting, dissolving into the ecology while not losing responsibility for one's own living. That's it.
Ecology and environmentalism has come up a couple of times, and you have a neat word that I ran across, this deep environmentalism kind of thing. But I always bristle at that a little bit because I see so many people that are coming at those issues of ecology and environmentalism, and what I see in it is this backdoor materialism.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Totally. I mean, the work that I do now is I am creating a nature reserve and a natural burial ground. So I care for people as they die and bury them, look after the grieving. And that is all within the context of a nature reserve. And for me, that is walking where I don't need to talk. I'm a representative of the land. It's not about me. And the whole point is to do something that is entirely ethical, entirely in line with my spiritual perspective, my animism, my love of the gods, my wonder at nature, while not consuming anything. And so many, my husband and I started the business specifically because so many ethical green businesses were either run haphazardly and essentially materialistically, or they were offering something which is a luxury. And it seems to me that if you, fair trade organic chocolate is wonderful, but God's, it's a luxury. And to do something totally ethical, you have to be doing something that's necessary, that we need as a community, as a race, as a species, which is what we decided to do, look after the land and bury people.
And it's beautifully small, and it's beautifully small. I'll leave it at that, because the other thing that troubles me is, I always run into problems when I talk to people who are talking about global warming, or now it's turned into climate change, which to me seems like a complete scam. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if the planet's warming at an alarming rate or not. I've looked into that data and I have my own opinion. But what I do know is when someone tries to tell me the solution is to create this world government that will therefore restrict everyone's carbon footprint and will determine through laws and taxation and all the rest of that, just control how everyone does, I say, wait a minute, guys, I've heard this same story before and it never turns out well, no matter how they spin it, you know? I don't know how you feel about that.
Yes, and I think control is about fear, and anything that provokes fear is not positive. I mean, that sounds silly, tautological, but anything that's about fear is going to be problematic. If you, again, studying human nature, one of the things we work with is understanding how fear works within non-human nature. It's just alertness. Immediately we make something alert. We have intruded on a space. Should we step back? Should we just meld? You know, just be aware of not provoking fear. It's never going to be an answer. It's never going to be a solution if you're provoking fear, evoking fear. And a lot of this doomsday stuff, it's the, you know, where we're coming to the apocalypse. It's all the end. It's about fear. It may not be okay. We may have turned, like Stephen Hawking says, we may have got to a tipping point, and now we're just on the end game.
Stephen Hawking, who so brilliantly told us that philosophy is dead. I always pull back a little bit with Stephen Hawking. I don't know exactly how you figure things out, but I'm not sure that philosophy is dead. So
I'm not sure he has an emotional intelligence or maybe that's just not what he's known for. But for me, it's not about responding to the fear. We step aside from the fear because it's not a useful way of reacting or a useful source of understanding. What we need to be doing is act not out of fear, but out of respect. So again, if we are respectful, if we are acting in a way which doesn't consume more than we need, we're doing it out of respect for those around us, in our relationships, in our human and non-human relationships. That's enough. And what can we do if we want to step forward and be a great political figure? And you know, I've never met a politician that didn't have some kind of striving for exploitation and power, and you know, they're not great people.
yeah.
It's the little people who are making the difference, doing the small things in society that are making a difference within their societies, within their communities. That's enough. It doesn't really matter what happens beyond if we are doing all that we can do in our own small world, in the world where we can make immediate and totally engaged relationships. Immediately we get out of those relationships, we're engaging with abstract ideas. We're fighting the man. We're fighting the authority. We're fighting this business. You know, all of these things. We're fighting abstracts, we're fighting concepts, we're not fighting actual people. If we make good relationships immediately around us, the people around us will make good relationships immediately around them. It's as simple as that. It's just about being peaceful.
Right, and even if that doesn't work all the way out, it just might find you a little bit of peace for the next 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, whatever it is, and then you have to deal with whatever happens, because there still might be some guys that roll up to your house with guns and battering rams, and you still have to deal with that. But in the meantime,
and you do. I mean, we've all lived, well, not all of us, but I've been through periods in my life with absolutely nothing, with in total crisis, right on the edge of death, and you deal with it in just the same way as you deal with wondering what to cook when you have people coming around and you've got a table full of ingredients, and you're just bathed in abundance. Every moment you deal with it as peacefully as you can, instead of getting protective, instead of getting defensive, instead of getting fearful, instead of striving for authority, instead of shouting at the man. Just live well now, here. Because time and space and all of that is just nonsense. It's all tools that you can work with in order to live well, but it's not truth. It's just life.
Emma, if people are drawn to what you're saying and your work, what's the best way? You said a minute ago, and I respect that. You don't want to generate this big cult following. That's not your goal. But what are some of the books that you have that people would be most interested in off of this conversation, do you think? And then how else might they get involved? I suppose if someone's really close to you, they might be interested in those, I don't know if you call them hospice, kind of after death kind of stuff, but tell us some of that stuff.
I wrote books on Druidry. In the 90s, I wrote a book on Druidry because I couldn't find a book about rich, emotional, sensual Druidry. And I wrote a book called Spirits of the Sacred Grove, which has just been republished. When it went to America, it was actually retitled Druid Priestess, which was ludicrous. But I think it's been published everywhere as Spirits of the Sacred Grove. And then I was commissioned to write a few more books on Druidry, like 3 or 4 more books. And then I stepped away from that big publishing companies, which I just couldn't cope with, and found a small publishing house. And they actually asked me to write a book on the Dark Goddess. And I was writing a book called Kissing the Hag, which is about the complicated, unpleasant aspects of woman nature. And I know you'll laugh. It's about, women as feminists can, be very proud of themselves in all kinds of ways and put down men. I'm not great as a feminist in that respect. I think that we're just as flawed, men and women. And I wanted to write a book about the drives within women that make us behave badly. The tempestuous, the emotional, the manipulative, all of these things. And how those change as we go through life.
I have to talk about this with you for a minute because I'm trying to wrap this thing up, but you've just hit on another thing. I think that's such an important issue, and you're a great person to bring that up because I tell you, at least in the States, I don't know about how it is in England and in Europe, but this whole feminism thing has really been respun and manipulated into this gender fluidity thing that really distorts, I think, some of the fundamental issues of female empowerment. I mean, in a way that you're talking about, what are some of your thoughts on the whole gender fluidity kind of nonsense? Hold it. Let me say nonsense. On one hand, that's awesome. If someone is gay, lesbian, or identifies in some way, I don't have a problem with that. But no. The idea that there is a reality to any of it, or that lessens the reality that most people experience of being attached to the female energy if you're a woman, or being attached to the male energy if you're a man, to kind of dismiss that in that same kind of atheistic, crazy, materialistic way, to me just seems like an abomination of the whole thing.
That's lovely. Yes, I'm with you completely. I don't care if someone's a man or a woman or something in between, and I really have no problem with sexuality or asexuality or who you want to fall in love with or sleep with. That's just so uninteresting or unnecessary or whatever. It's just what I have a problem with is indignation. I find the indignant person quite ugly, and I think there is beauty in self-expression. There is beauty in self-acceptance. There's beauty in fluidity in the way that we make relationships. But immediately we stand up in our own little separate individual self and become indignant. We cause trouble, and that's something to be very awake to in ourselves. Immediately I'm indignant, I stop and go, oh no, what's gone wrong? I'm misthinking this. Stop being indignant, that's dreadful. The other thing that I dislike is the celebration of victimhood. And I think, I know it's the part of my age, I'm into my early 50s. And when I was young, as a feminist, I wasn't taught to be a feminist. I was taught to survive well. So if some older man in his 40s, 50s, and I was like 6 or 7, was going to touch me inappropriately, I was taught to smack him, to get up and walk away. I was taught to have the strength to say, no, piss off. And I know, because I was bullied as a child for other reasons, I know that it's hard when people behave ferociously towards you, when they bully you. I was raped at the age of 16. And then, so I understand these things, but I wouldn't sit in, I mean, some of the experiences I had as a child, people step up and create, massive problems about. And to me, that's just a bad night. You just carry on. Because I was taught to be strong and not be a victim, you just carry on. And I know that some people struggle and have broken
right.
by dreadful experiences. And I'm not questioning that at all. And I would, I hope, pray that they find the strength. And I've been through periods where I've broken for other reasons, and I, found the strength to keep going. But the celebration of victimhood, the way that so many feminists focus on the victim and focus on getting people to express and explore the victim inside them instead of finding their strength and their emotional fluency, their emotional literacy, their emotional strength to get over it and to move on, to let it go, I think one of the main things I would say is just get over yourself.
And that's going to be really hard for some people to say, because there is a lot of, I totally get what you're saying. There is a lot of trauma, as you're acknowledging, out there, and a lot of people are dealing with it in a lot of different ways. My approach, because my background is basically as a business person, so my approach has always been, it's just not effective. And there's other ways that are more effective, So if you want to play the victim card, just practically speaking, you are going to be mired in that. And when what you really want is to get to the other side of that, we all acknowledge that. And a more effective way of getting to the other side of it is what you're talking about. The other part that I see that you were hitting on at the beginning, that I don't know, I'd like to hear you spin off on a little bit further, because I don't know how people process it, but I get the bottom line of it, and I'm not liking what I'm hearing. And that's that to not acknowledge gender differences between the majority of the population that identifies themselves as either a man or a woman, and to not acknowledge those differences seems to me to be this other crazy, materialistic, in a way, game of, just denying that we have free will, and that as collectively we seem to have these tendencies. That doesn't mean that we're tied to that. That doesn't mean that I can't, get in touch with my feminine side, but mostly I identify with a lot of things that it seems like other guys identify with. I mean, at some point that has to be okay to factor that into the equation.
Yes, I'm not sure I'm hearing exactly what you're saying, but I think for me, I think it's all just, it's all fine. Whatever, just get over it.
Well, when you were talking about your book, you were talking about kind of celebrating the womanhood, right? And implicit in that is saying that there does seem to be, in general, some kind of tendencies towards women. You weren't saying that this is just my experience and no one else experiences it. You were kind of saying, gee, it seems like a lot of other women experience the same thing I experience.
Yes, absolutely. And also, there are lots of ways in which we as women behave badly towards each other, towards ourselves, and towards men. And we need to just be awake to that instead of declaring that it's okay. Perhaps we can just declare that that's human nature, that's woman nature, and maybe there are ways of getting through it in different ways. And I enjoyed writing the book, but it isn't the most important book that I think I've written. But of course, it's the best-selling book, and it's the most celebrated book, and it's the book that most people talk to me about. Because it's fascinating, wild feminists and trans people and, youngsters coming, through their puberty and people menopausing, all women come to me and say, oh, that book really talks to me. And also many men have come to me and say, thank you for that book. It helps me to understand my wife, my girlfriend, which is lovely. It's great. But actually, the next book I wrote is that Living with Honor is the book that I'm more proud of. That's an ethics book. I wanted to write about ethics, and an ethics of animism. And when you consider nature to be sacred, how do you survive? I mean, if you can put to one side the sentient folk and the sacred folk, and you don't eat or use those, the sacred folk or the sentient folk, then that's fine. Everything else you can use. Everything else is stuff that you can consume. But when everything is sacred and everything is sentient, how do you survive? Because you need to eat, you need to find shelter. How do you make decisions? And that's really what that book's about, making decisions based on the fact that nature is sacred comprehensively. And then having written an ethics, Living with Honor, then I started to realize that one of the basic premise of Living with Honor was an assumption that I hadn't been clear about, which is nature is sacred. Why is nature sacred? Because it is conscious, it's minded. And so then I decided to write the book that you spoke of first, The Wakeful World, which is an exploration of why nature is sacred. You know how as kids we ask questions and, the lazy parent will go, just because, well, just because what? Answer the question. Well, just because. Actually, I don't know the answer. It's just because. And I wanted to make sure that there was no just because. Not that I had an answer for everything, but that it was clear that I had thought through everything so that I wasn't sitting on an unexplored assumption. And those are so hard, like unexplored prejudices are assumptions which are so fundamental that we don't know they're there. And that's the same. Well, prejudices come from those assumptions, those basic beliefs, which are so fundamental to our nature as individuals, as people in certain communities, cultures, that we don't actually know they're there. And materialism is one of those assumptions. Not one that I have had, but I see it all around me. Our language supports it. And when realizing that, that nature is sacred, nature is minded, is such a totally different fundamental paradigm, that then I realized that the ethics book is really quite difficult. But if you have that paradigm that nature is minded, then the ethics makes sense. So having written the ethics, then I realized that people were finding this hard. Why? Oh, it's because it's such a big leap from materialism to an animist perspective.
Right.
I mean, experiential, comprehensive, total perception of animism, not an intellectualized concept of animism. When we live in a way where everything we touch, everything we interact with, we immediately and fully recognize as sentient, that's a different experience.
And an experience that we probably can never completely get there. I mean, we are enmeshed in this materialism, whether we like it or not. And what I find, and by the way, your books are brilliantly written. They're just beautifully written. As someone who's published one book and just struggled mightily to get it out, I sit there in awe of what you do. But it is okay that we are only trying to expand our comfort zone by being more in that space and being less materialistic, because anyone who moves in that direction feels that freedom, even if we can't get all the way there, right?
Well, yes, I think so. But also understanding that there are cultures that have that complete animistic foundation. The Native American cultures, the cultures that I interacted with as a child in the Amazon, the Amazonian Indians, and folk that I was engaging with philosophically in Japan, in the Shinto communities, people who were talking about Shintoism there, absolutely non-materialistic in terms of their philosophical perspective, completely animistic. And the great divide between that and the materialistic is so big that the lack of understanding is profound. I did a conference. I also work with an organization called Honoring the Ancient Dead, which is looking after ancient human remains or ancient ancestors that are exhumed, the bones of the long dead, that are exhumed and then put into museums or kept in store cupboards, just disrespected. And Honoring the Ancient Dead puts forward this understanding, this perspective that these are people. They're not just bones. They're not just bits of stuff. They're people.
Yeah, but all that just gets a little bit problematic. I kind of always recoil when people say that. Yeah, so the Amazonian people are animistic until somebody walks in with a frickin' machete and then they say, wow, this kind of works pretty good. And the next day somebody walks in with a chainsaw, and some people say no, but some people say yes. And I also relate to your other story where you talk to the, Native American Canadian people who are honest and say, gee, we have a hard time stripping out some of the dogma and the orthodoxy that's kind of hung around for a long time. I mean, it's all, we're all trying to figure out the same thing. I think we're all someplace in that gray area. I'm not totally on board with that you can be totally animistic. I think you can be kind of more in that than a lot of us could move in that direction pretty comfortably without ever having to kind of pull back. But
I think my experience is that it's like, one of those cubes where all the lines are drawn in and you can just shift your perspective of which side is frontways. Do you know what I mean? There's a name for that. I can't remember what it is.
Yeah, the Rubik's Cube, yeah.
When you shift and the front is there, and then you can shift your perspective and the front is the other side of the cube. And that instant shift of perspective is what I feel it is. I think you can see everything as alive, you can feel, you can react, you can respond moment by moment to everything as minded, or you can shift your perspective and what is around you is inert. And that is, I think, a radical shift of perspective. I think there is a grey area in terms of the intellectualizing or the understanding of it, but not the experience of it moment to moment.
We could go on and on. It is so awesome talking to you, Emma. It's been absolutely great. I'm glad you shared that wonderful list of books that you have, and I hope people do check out one or more of these books because they're really so fantastic. I think you really enjoy them. Thanks again.
I can write in a way which is a bit more coherent than talking, and I'm burbling with enthusiasm. I think my mind goes all over the place. But our conversation over the last hour or so has been all over the place like a swarm of honeybees. It's great.
Well, I took the lead in one of your presentations where you said that you don't like to prepare too much in advance because the only thing that's ever happening is what's happening now. So I think we lived up to that to a certain extent, and that's awesome.
Absolutely. I don't prepare much in advance. It is moment to moment because it's about relationship. And it's been great talking to you, Alex. Thank you.
Thanks again to Emma for joining me today on Skeptiko. There are many questions I could tee up from this interview, but I'll just pick the easiest, obvious one. Has science ultimately failed us? In the balance, good and bad, we can look at our lasers and our iPhones and our GPS. But on the other side, you can look at the things that you might not like about society, culture, or the way things are going, however you slice that. Has science failed us is the question. Of course, the place to weigh in with your answer is through the Skeptiko website or the Skeptiko forum. Please join the forum if you haven't. We get some really, really smart, interesting people over there, and they create a great dialogue. I know many of our guests join us after the show, and that creates a great interaction too. So please, if you're inclined to do so, join the forum. Of course, you also want to download any previous shows that you missed, and you can do all that for free at the Skeptiko website, skeptiko.com. You can also leave a comment there, drop me a note, whatever you like. Stay connected with the show, share the show, all that good stuff, and stick around for more Skeptico. I have some good episodes coming up. Until next time, take care. Bye for now.